Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Laurie, welcome along to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. Really excited to sit with you.
Excited to be here with you too, Michael.
Now, this is the book, and it is really something else. Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. And it's a heck of a ride. You've had a big life, and there's a lot there to unpack. And I'm looking forward to going back in time, tracing some of your journey that leads to December 8, 1980, because it really is a singular kind of journey for you. And the book's a great contribution just to the history of rock and roll. It must have been quite an experience for you to get this out. And I'm curious, maybe right out of the gates, what was the period of time from conception of idea to having the book in the world?
Well, first of all, I should mention that the title of my book is Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. It's the story of my rock radio related life and career and covers almost all of the rock star interviews I've ever done, which are so many, and includes lots of their quotes too, which has been really exciting to me. And people asked me for years to write a book, and I tried to get time and was finally able to do that.
And it must be a rewarding thing when you know that it's in the world and you get feedback from readers and get an understanding of the impact that it's had.
Absolutely. People have been really, really positive about it, especially since they all encouraged me to write it so much, and that makes me feel great.
Yeah, that's really wonderful stuff. I'd love to go back because in the book you write with great affection of the impact that radio had on you, and obviously also for John, radio was a very big part of his formative years. And you particularly talk about what was then the number one radio FM station in LA, if I have that right, KMET. And I get the sense that this playlist really opened up your ears. Could you describe what that was for a younger person at the time?
Well, thanks to me terrifically being able to get a transistor radio as a toddler that I plugged in my ears and listened to practically all day and all night back then, because it helped me avoid my dysfunctional, cruel family upbringing. And I fell in love with all the rock music I heard on the radio right away. And that's lasted throughout my entire life. Even though I started basically listening to AM stations back then, I worked my way up to FM. Plus, it, of course, helped and eventually sent me in the direction of my successful rock radio and video career, which has been super exciting for me and so fantastic to remember all the great work I've been able to do over all the years of my life. And as I describe in my book, it's primarily due to my eventual tuning in and frequent listening to KMET-FM, this superstation that played and introduced me to the music of plenty of great rock stars I fell immediately in love with. Everyone from David Bowie to Lou Reed
Yeah.
and so many more. And I've loved KMET DJs too, especially B. Mitchell Reed, and I won so many of their super cool contests on the air.
Yeah, and I want to talk about B. Mitchell Reed. I found that piece of the story quite fascinating. You know, often we have these moments in our life where there's an intersection. Someone says a certain thing or offers us a certain opportunity that lights a fire inside of us. And you seem to have had that with B. Mitchell Reed. If I have it right, he was known as the Beamer back in the day. And he offered you some words of encouragement. You were, and correct me if I have this wrong, 17 years of age. You'd, as you mentioned, always winning prizes. You've won tickets to see the Stones in 73. I imagine that's at the time of exile. And this seems to be this key moment in your life in this interaction with him. Could you just take us back to that evening?
Well, it was incredibly awesome to have the Beamer ask me to come on the air with him when I got to the KMET station office to pick up the Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit tickets I just won for their show that night at the Forum. It was January 18th, 1973. And I was so excited that my date and I would be sitting in the Forum's front row. And I'd never seen the Stones before, so I was obviously super thrilled, especially when the Beamer told me I should plan an on air radio career for myself since I had a great voice and I knew exactly what to say to interest and excite all of his listeners. So that made me feel terrific, and it still does when I think about it.
Yes, you go on to have this incredible career right through radio, and it opens up so many doors for you professionally. But when we get to 1977, if I have that correct, there's this landmark RKO documentary that is released, The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend, though it doesn't originally start out with that title. And it's quite an exhaustive on-air telling of the story, which was kind of cutting edge at the time in terms of radio doc making. This was obviously a very big undertaking, and there'd really been nothing like it before in the story of the Beatles on radio. I think it'd be nice to unpack the story around that.
I was amazed and excited when I got hired as the news editor at KFRC Radio in San Francisco to also get asked to write and co-produce a super lengthy RKO Radio Beatles special, which of course would take lots of work, including research, interviews, and plenty more. So I worked all day and also all night, practically at KFRC for both jobs. And I came up with the 14-hour special called RKO Presents the Beatles that was super popular the minute it started playing across the country on RKO radio stations. And then we almost immediately expanded it to 17 hours right away, since it got supplemented to play all around the world. And we changed the title to the first one I'd come up with, The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. And Beatles producer George Martin told me a couple years later during our amazingly complimentary January 1980 interview that it was the best Beatles radio show he'd ever heard in his entire life.
Wow.
And he already listened to it twice in the United Kingdom. And this is actually a copy that it first did when it appeared on a copy like this.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah, everybody who heard it liked it and a lot, and I still listen to it every once in a while.
Yeah. Do you listen to it on vinyl as well?
I try.
Yeah.
I absolutely try. Because
Yeah.
records are still important to me.
Aren't they? And correct me if I'm wrong, you saw the Beatles at Dodger Stadium, am I right?
I did in the summer of 1966. It was really cool because I would never have been able to go. My mother certainly wouldn't have ever gotten me tickets. But the mother of a friend of mine in elementary school, it was her daughter's birthday, and she bought a bunch of tickets to take all of her friends, at least a handful of friends, and we all went, and it was very cool. I fell in love with them. I'd already was in love with them, but then I really fell in love with them.
Yeah. Do you have a vivid memory of that night at all, of what it was like?
I do, and unfortunately, it being at Dodger Stadium, it wasn't really a venue for concerts,
Yeah.
so it wasn't the best place possible to see a great band, but I still definitely enjoyed it. But the rest of the audience was mostly teenage girls, and they were standing up and dancing and screaming during the whole thing, so that kind of hurt us a little bit.
Yeah, sure. You have this remarkable run, 78, 79, and obviously 1980, where respectively you're speaking with George at the time of pre-production for what would become his self-titled solo, and then of course Paul and Linda at the time, I think, of Back to the Egg. It's quite a remarkable 3 years back to back. I notice in the George Harrison interview, which you write about in the book, and there's some transcript there of the conversation, you seem to get a very open George. He seems to be a very relaxed George. He's having fun with you. What was your take on it at the time it was happening? Did you feel the same thing?
Absolutely. George adored telling me not only all about his super popular song, My Sweet Lord, for the lengthy radio show I was writing and co-producing, the top 100 of the 70s for RKO Radio and Drake Chenault, but also all about how thrilled he was to have recently gotten married to Olivia in September that year, just after they'd had their son Danny in August. And George was also super happy to finally be a house husband, a daddy, and a gardener, and a tree planter
Yeah.
in the backyard of his British estate. He loved it. It was so much more to him than just being a musician.
Yeah. And how did you manage as a fan to keep yourself grounded? And must have, by this time you're very seasoned and you've sat with some greats. Did that become more relaxing for you the more that you did and you were able to see the individual person in a conversation or hear them in a conversation beyond celebrity? Did that get easier and easier for you?
Yeah, I tried, but I'd already done so many interviews at that point, people at the radio station coming, everyone from my favorite band, the Ramones,
Yeah.
and Talking Heads came and I got to interview them at the station. And of course, I interviewed um, Grace Slick and
Yeah.
Paul Kantner. And, it was just really cool. There were so many people I got to interview, and that was in addition to all the news interviews that I did too. So it never stopped being exciting for me.
Yeah. What a remarkable journey. You seem to also get a very energetic and fun Paul McCartney when you sit with both he and Linda at the time of pre-release for Back to the Egg. I've heard some of your stories and you write about it in the book. It sounds like a lot of fun and it obviously had a big impression on you. Can you take us through that 79 conversation and the experience of that?
Well, I'd never been to England yet, so I was super excited to be sent there with my RKO radio team before our scheduled January 15th, 1979 interview with Paul and Linda McCartney and their latest lineup of Wings. And that was right before Paul's birthday, which is January 18th. And it was just so thrilling, and it gave us the opportunity beforehand, getting there a day or two earlier, to go to Abbey Road Studios and taking a picture there with Dave and Ron. And also, I got to go to the Marquee Club, which is a
Mm,
very famous venue in London, to see the LA-based new wave band, the Knack, which had
mm,
just come out, and they performed My Sharona, which was my favorite song of theirs there. And then when it came the next day to our interview with Paul and Linda and Wings, they were not only totally talkative and friendly, but Paul went out of his way to give me gifts, especially when I told him that my very favorite song of his was Silly Love Songs, which I still love more than anything.
yeah.
And that I also adored seeing his wife Linda's amazing professional photos. So Paul went into the closet in the room that we were doing the interview in, and immediately came out and brought me the single of my favorite song, plus Linda's latest photography book. And then they both autographed them lovingly for me. And here is the copy of Silly Love Songs that Paula and Linda
Wow.
lovingly autographed. And so did the guy who helped them write it. So that was really exciting. And I
Incredible.
still have it
Yeah.
and save it and play it every now and then. And also, the cool thing is that Paul also hugged and kissed me towards the tail end of our interview, right before we took our fab photo together, that I still hang on my wall and I love to look at. And here, I'll show you too.
Yeah, isn't that something else?
It's amazing. And I still look at it and I think, wow, I wish I could kiss Paul McCartney again. That would be so cool. So love to have him back. Love to
Yeah,
see him again.
you seem to get these guys at these exactly the right times in their careers and in their lives. They're happy and there's a joy in them. And that obviously will move ahead to John because it's very much the same thing. They're at these points in their lives where they seem to be excited about their careers and excited about life, which I think is really something special. When we get to November 17, 1980, Double Fantasy has entered the world. And on December 7, you and the team from RKO find yourselves en route to New York City for a December 8th sit down with John and Yoko, no less at the Dakota, on what's going to be a very big day, particularly for him with Annie Leibovitz and the session that's happening there, and then yourselves in the afternoon. And they're obviously got a lot going on back to back. Could you tell us how that opportunity came up and what was that like for you, knowing that you were about to jump on a flight and head to New York to have this experience?
Well, I was, of course, incredibly excited to know that I'd be with John Lennon and Yoko Ono at the Dakota to talk about everything from Double Fantasy to their get together again after what John called his lost weekend in Los Angeles. And I was with my RKO co interviewer and music director Dave Sholin and our producer engineer Ron Hummel, who I'd also been to London with the year before for the Paul McCartney interview. Plus, this time, also Warner Brothers Records executive Bert Keane joined us. And we loved staying the night before at the same hotel that the Beatles got to stay at when they first came to the US years before for their very first Ed Sullivan show. And it was so great, even though our interview date got picked by Yoko's astrologer, who asked us all our birth dates to help him figure out what would be best. And although John and Yoko were already supposed to be and planned to be in Hawaii in the west coast of the California back then. Instead, they changed their plans for us. Darn it! And that's just part of why I've felt totally guilty ever since John got killed that very same day.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And we will move into that phase. You write in chapter 17 of your book, Number 9 Dream is the name of the chapter. What strikes me most about our John and Yoko interview when I listen back to it all these years later is how it turned out to be anything but a traditional artist interview. I'd love you to take us through your eyes into the Dakota on that particular day. And I'd like to know, what was the conversation you perhaps expected to have? And then as it began to move and shift, what did the conversation end up becoming for you and how did you navigate that? You write also, this became anything but a traditional artist interview, something quite rich and deep. And I sat in the interview only overnight when I knew I'd be sitting with you today and listened to an unedited version that sits on YouTube. It's moving, it's dynamic, and it's navigated very well. And John's brimming with life. At one point he laughs and there's the conversations about parenthood. And he laughs and says, something like, when are we going to talk about the album? When are we going to talk about music? So you get all of John. You get so much of him. So again, I guess the short version of that question is, what was it like moving into the Dakota? And what was it like as that conversation evolved? And how did you each manage to navigate that so effectively?
Well, I should mention right off the bat that every single one of the chapters in my book, all 18, is named after one of my all-time favorite songs that to me describe what the chapter's about. So I hope when everybody reads it, they really get it and have a good time with it.
Absolutely.
And as you mentioned, the main chapter about my time with John and Yoko is Number 9 Dream. And I should mention that Number 9 Dream is from his 1974 solo album That was a big deal for John, especially considering that he was born on October 9th, 1940. And as I mentioned right off the bat in my book, during our incredible John and Yoko interview, we covered expected basics like the release of their latest album, Double Fantasy, and their music in general. But we also discussed details about women's rights, politics, religion, hangovers, headaches, fatherhood, parenting, and even eating junk food, which made John just kind of crumble. And I loved being able to be together in their private, beautifully decorated office and having John Lennon come in and sit super close to me on their awesome love seat. And it was just amazing and unbelievable almost. And even though we'd been told in advance by the record company not to bring up the Beatles or his past at all, John ended up doing so himself anyway, a certain point, and told us all about his awesome very first introduction to Yoko Ono that took place at the art gallery where she was having a major exhibit. And that was many months before their very first date, which he fully described as not only including their first music making as a couple and recording, but also their very first love making. Wow. And John also brought up his number one meetup with Paul McCartney back in July 1957, when John was just 16 and Paul was 15. And he told us that they met at a garden party in Liverpool where John's band, the Quarrymen, was performing. And a mutual a friend introduced them backstage in time for Paul to quickly impress John by showing him how to tune up a guitar. And of course, that eventually led John to ask Paul to join his band and perform with him. And of course, the years showed how great that decision was.
Yeah, look, it's such a rich conversation. And as you go through it again with fresh ears, like I recently did, you can hear so much of that conversation is echoed through the decades as sound bites and quotes because he's so giving, he's so open. And while it's not an organized question that I had for you in our preparation, I did want to ask you, I didn't expect to spend as much time in the top end of the interview as I did, where it starts with a conversation with Yoko before John walks in, because I think he's been getting the photographs with Annie, and he comes in and excuses himself for being late. But you managed to each capture a very open Yoko, and she speaks so eloquently, she's so connected, so giving. What was that experience like for you? I'm curious about that moment as I was listening to the audio. You're sitting there with Yoko.
I like to think that Yoko was thrilled to be there first and to talk to me because I was the only other female in the room. So she kind of related to me in a way. And we talked about relationships, not just the one with her and John, but relationships with their fans in general and how important that was for their album that they put together, Double Fantasy. It was all about getting the relationships between men and women to be so much better. So it was super cool. And when John finally did open the door, because he had done some solo photos for Rolling Stone with Annie Leibovitz too, the first thing he did when he opened in and pulled down his glasses, I looked at him jokingly and said, "Can't you tell we're in the middle of an interview, John?" And he laughed. And that's when he came and sat down right next to me, like he was incredibly in favor of having me there too. So that was really cool. And it was just amazing because John immediately loved talking about creating double fantasy as well. And I can tell you all about that if you like.
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, it was totally cool because John adored talking about it and being in Bermuda the summer before, months before we were together with his son Sean on vacation. And he had started to write songs again, which he hadn't, he said, in so long. And it was even while he was swimming with Sean in Bermuda. And they were swimming together, and he was writing, and he started calling and playing the songs for Yoko, who been staying at the Dakota. She wasn't with them because she needed to keep working. And then Yoko was so excited to hear them that she started creating songs herself to play back to John. So she contacted him and played them and sang them for him. And they were so happy when he finally got home and they could start working together on music and then recording what would be their very first album in years, Double Fantasy. And John was not sure if he ever wanted to schedule any concert tours again. And certainly he never wanted to without having Yoko on stage with him, along with the musicians that they'd been recording in the studio with. And it was super noticeable how excited John was to be making awesome music again, especially with Yoko Ono.
I have to say to you, and as I was listening to the interview again, it's such a beautifully navigated conversation, and the questions are so intelligent, and they're respectfully insightful questions that prompt him and her to open up. I think the way you greeted him when he walked into the room with that immediate response of "Can't you see we're..." I imagine he would have loved that sense of confidence, which probably disarmed him and got him straight away into a state of mind of, "Oh, okay, I'm going to like you," because you haven't shrunk away in that moment. And that might have played a big role into setting the tone that opens him up so well. I imagine that energy in the room was palpable. When you play back that time in your life sitting there, and I'm sure it's all fond, is there a micro moment, a micro memory, or something that is a core memory for you that you have a connection to where you think, "Oh, I loved that particular little piece there"?
Well, not only did John laugh with me and like me, obviously, right away, but my absolutely favorite moments, having John sit so close to me, was when John praised my interview comments and questions more than anybody else I'd ever interviewed had. And he said complimentary things to me all the time, like, "Yes, love, exactly,
Yeah.
Laurie." And it made me feel so intelligent and so capable. And I felt just great the whole time. And I adored having an awesome photo taken of me with John and Yoko also at the tail end of our talk together, which has also been used on my book cover. As you showed, this is the black and white version of the photo that the amazing artist who is actually a Grammy Award winner for album covers, designed. But the actual color photo itself of me with John and Yoko is something I have huge on the wall of my living room
Yeah.
that I look at all the time because it means so much to me. And he still means so much to me. I wish more than anything that he was still alive, and
Mm.
actually more than anybody.
Yeah, I can only say that I completely agree with you. The world would be a very different place. There's so much in that interview that John gives us, and as we get to the back end of the interview, he talks a lot about life and death, and it's almost quite eerie the degree to which he talks about hoping that he goes before Yoko because he couldn't bear the pain. And again, it's quite remarkable that he's saying all of these things.
Yeah, I
I I,
agree.
I
It
imagine
was
when you look,
just amazing for him to say, "I don't want to die before Yoko. I mean, excuse me, I don't want Yoko to die before me,"
yeah,
which was almost like him saying, "I want to die before Yoko," which that's what I think of afterwards.
yeah, it's really something else. But as I say, not only is he quite profound in that conversation with his views, and he's full of so much energy, there's these little wonderful moments of beyond the veil of celebrity, and it's it's just a couple of people in a room. And correct me if I'm wrong, you gifted a Godzilla type wind up dinosaur toy for Sean toward the end. And in the audio that I was listening to last night, we hear it winding up and running across a table. Could you just share that beautiful moment before you were leaving the Dakota, what that was like?
Well, I brought two things with me to the Dakota. First of all, I brought a copy of the Yoko Ono book, Grapefruit, that I loved. And I wanted them to see how much I loved it. So I brought it to show them. And they were so excited. They hadn't seen a copy in a long time and immediately said, "We both want to autograph it for you." So they did. And John was thrilled to autograph it because he'd written the introduction to the book, and I put the autograph in my book as well. So everybody who has my book now has John and Yoko's autograph as though they'd gotten it for themselves. And here it is in my book, and it's loving and really personal. And
Yeah.
the other thing I brought was, like you mentioned, the toy for their son Sean. And even though Sean wasn't there, I of course gave it to Yoko and John, and they were so thrilled. And John immediately wound it up and let it travel up and down all over the coffee table in front of the love seat that we were sitting on. And they both said, "Wow, we don't know if we're going to give it to Sean because we love it so much ourselves. Maybe we just want to play with it." So even after John died, I didn't know if they'd given it to him. And I didn't have any contact with Sean. He wasn't there. He was being taken care of by their babysitter that day. But then years later, I finally got to meet Sean at the at his movie that he'd done that eventually won an Academy Award.
Yeah.
And the first thing I said to him was that, I had done the last interview with his father, which he was concerned about. And I said, "But I'm really curious. Did your mother, Yoko, ever give you the toy that I brought for you?" And he said, "What was the toy? Describe it."
Ah,
And I did. And he said, "Oh my God, yes, it was my favorite toy in the
come on.
entire world. I loved it my entire life as a child." And that made me feel great. So I immediately signed a copy of my book and gave it to him. And hopefully he read it and loved it and gave it to his mother to read too. I hope so.
What a life you've had. There's a lot of time in that interview where we hear John very excitedly talking about what's happening now. And again, I know it's not a prepped question I had for you, but I just wanted to touch on that. He references the Cars, and he's aware of Lena Lovitch and the hearing of what Yoko had been doing in the B-52s. He seems very connected to what's going on. Toward the end, he's prompted to remember Dave Edmunds, "I Hear You Knocking," and he talks fondly about how he loves what Dave Edmunds is doing as well. You got the sense, I imagine, that he was still very much tuned in to what was happening around him musically in the culture. Did you get that?
Well, yes and no. In a way, he was hearing about the
Ah,
music that was coming out from people that he knew
right.
rather than discovering it himself,
Yeah.
which was interesting to me.
Yeah, okay. Fascinating. Kenneth Womack very eloquently writes in your book's foreword, to be able to mine so much humanity during something as perfunctory as an interview, which is a publicity exercise after all, is a subtle gift that Kaye possesses in spades. That's high praise, and it's very succinct. As that gift evolved in you, that manner that you had to navigate a conversation with someone like a John or a Yoko, was that something you were conscious of as you fine-tuned that craft, or was it very intuitive? Were you just a very good listener and responding in real time to where the conversation needed to go with artists? I'm just curious about your process.
Well, I think I was very, very interested in hearing them talk. And I really, in a way, didn't want the interview to end, even though it had lasted so long and I felt so great. But the thing was, they needed to go to their recording studio session, and my team had offered to give them a ride to the studio because their ride themselves apparently they told us wasn't able to take them there. So the guys that I was with, who were going, both of them, to the airport to leave that night, said, "Yeah, sure, we'll take you there on the way to the airport." And I wasn't going because I was staying the night in New York to hang out with a friend of mine. So when I walked out of the Dakota, then I said goodbye to the both of them, and they got in the car and left. But when I left the Dakota, I got disgustingly accosted, bugged, and followed for blocks by a creepy guy I wanted to smack and kick because he kept saying super obnoxious things to me like, "Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What'd he say? What'd he say? What'd he say?" And although he finally left me alone after following me for blocks and blocks, I it was hours later that I saw him on TV as the one who admitted and was arrested for assassinating John Lennon. Yikes. And I felt ever since that it was absolutely my fault for not reporting him to the Dakota security team when he started to bug and bother me and wouldn't leave me alone, since they might have noticed that he had a gun in the pocket of the coat he was wearing, which I unfortunately did not because I just didn't want to look at him that much. And they could have, the team could have called the cops and got him taken away. Darn, I was and am still totally horrified and feeling guilty.
Mm,
But
mm,
I never say or print that jerk's name that
mm,
killed John, since I don't ever want to publicize him. In fact, I wish that he'd been assassinated and killed himself
mm,
instead of staying in jail
mm.
and trying every year to get out. But fortunately, at least they haven't let him out.
Yes, I know, I hear you. He who shall not be named. And I think I'm curious what that was like for you. I know that in the hours that follow the news, you find yourself caught up in the media storm and you're sitting down and talking about it and recounting. And you write quite powerfully about what that experience was like for you. I'm just curious, knowing how much music has meant to you, how much the Beatles meant, how much John meant. It must have been like living in a bit of a nightmare. You come out of this experience, I imagine you're on cloud nine. You're accosted by this goon on the street. He's bothering you. And in hours, this news breaks that John Lennon's gone. What does that do to you in those first hours? Going from this incredible high to the worst shocking low you could possibly imagine.
I cried, I was horrified, and I was at the New York RKO office, the and I was answering interview questions from people all over the world about what it had been like. And that's then when I heard on TV that John hadn't just been shot, that he had actually been killed. And I was horrified. And I was asked to be on the Today Show the next morning. And I immediately started crying, and I was miserable and upset being on the Today Show, but I was on it anyway. And then I went back to the West Coast by the plane right afterwards and immediately started writing the special with the bulk of our interview. And I titled it John Lennon, the Man, the Memory. And it played within, I believe it was 6 days after he'd been killed.
Mm,
And of course, was very popular because everybody wanted to hear the interview. And I'd always been told that I'd done great rock star interviews, and especially John Lennon's last one. And I'd been asked and bugged for years to write my book
mm.
with full descriptions and lots of rock star quotes, especially his, but also so many of the others I've done, everybody from Paul McCartney to George Harrison, the Ramones, Mick Jagger, David Bowie, you
Yeah.
name it. And so I finally was able to. But the thing is, I wasn't able to write my book for years and years. And even though people bugged me and said, Laurie, you need to, I couldn't because I was so busy full time working. But finally, in 2020, when the creepy COVID disease hit the world, all of a sudden my production career came to an end because TV and radio production stopped for quite a while and it dropped. So I finally had time to start writing my rock radio related memoir. And then um, Kenneth Womack, who'd interviewed me for his book beforehand about John Lennon's last days, read mine. And he encouraged me to get published right away and helped me and offered to write the amazing foreword for
Mm.
my book, Yay, which of course appears lengthy in my book. And he told me that my book was great and apparently still thinks so.
The book's got a cinematic quality to it, and as you're reading it, it's very visual, and you kind of put us in your shoes right from your journey as a younger person through and what forms you and then drives and motivates you along the way. And there's a lot of vulnerability in there, a lot of truth, and it's, as I say, it has almost like a cinematic quality to it. And not the least of which, and again, correct me if I have this recollection wrong, on the night of the shooting, you write about, am I right, making your way to Roosevelt Hospital and looking through and in those first, I guess those first hours after the fact. Again, I could almost see it in my mind like a scene in a film.
Well, when I first heard about John being shot, I was basically coming back from dinner to my friend's apartment in New York, and he opened the door and he said, "Oh, the radio's on because I want to discourage people from breaking in." And the radio was on, but instead of music, it was a newscaster saying John Lennon's been shot and he's at the Roosevelt Hospital. And I went, "Oh my God." And I immediately ran out to the middle of the street and grabbed a cab and went to the hospital. And when I got there, I jumped out of the cab and looked in the big major window doorway, and I saw Yoko crying hysterically.
Mm.
And I thought, oh my God, I don't believe John has just been shot. I believe he's dead. And I didn't want to go in and bug Yoko because I thought, oh my God, she'll blame me and and that'll be horrible. So that's when I immediately went to the phone that was right outside the hospital and called the RKO radio people and told them what was going on. And they said, "Oh, come to our office immediately." So that's when I went, started doing interviews, and got
Mm.
asked to be on the Today Show shortly afterwards.
Yeah, it must have been
So
surreal.
yeah, it was very freaky to find out, and I was horrified and extremely upset and sad. And it's almost been 46 years. I've
Yeah,
still been sad, and especially every anniversary, December 8th, every year, I cry hysterically.
yeah. When you look back and reflect, music seems to have really impacted you as a younger person and informed so much of your life. What has rock and roll meant to you?
Oh, rock music has always meant everything to me throughout my entire life, from being a tiny kid all the way up to today. And that's years and years and years. And I not only still love listening to lots of radio stations and records, because I have a huge collection, but I also still dig seeing as many live concerts as I can, even though tickets are sadly super expensive these days, and I don't get them free like I used to when I worked in rock radio and,
Yeah, I bet.
and TV music companies.
Yeah.
And some of my recent super favorite rock shows include the Steve Miller Band. I've
Yeah.
always been a huge fan, and AC/DC. Hart, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, and Lawrence Juber, who
Yeah.
was actually a Wings member.
Hmm.
I was lucky to interview at the time I was sent to London to interview Paul and Linda and Wings. And so I see everybody I can all the time. And I have friends who are in bands too, and I see them as well.
Yeah, I love the fact that fire is still in you. And almost as a sidebar, it would be remiss of me not to ask you, post December 8, 1980, and the shift that is in your own life, you do find yourself working with Dick Clark for a little while. And I thought that was fascinating as well. Could you just share a little bit about that experience? I thought that sounded quite incredible.
Well, as I talk about in my book, I actually met Dick Clark when I just graduated from high school because he and Chubby Checker chose me and my date as the contest winners of their dance contest that they were
Come
having
on.
for the promo for Dick's huge upcoming ABC TV rock series. So I won, and they were super complimentary. And Chubby Checker said to me, "Laurie, are you already a a a huge dancer? Is that your career?" And I laughed and I said, "No, Chubby, I started dancing when I first heard you as a kid singing the twist when I was a little toddler listening to you on the radio." And he laughed and he loved that. And then a few years later, when I applied and was immediately hired to go to work for Dick Clark, writing his weekly radio show, and he loved it. He said I was such a great writer that he immediately said to me, "Laurie, I want you to ghostwrite my weekly, extensively syndicated newspaper column. You can pretend you're me when you go to concerts and do interviews and write." So of course I did, and a lot of that is in my book that people can read and find out all the details too. And that was really cool. And I was super excited to become a huge friend of Dick Clark and his family, and go hang out at his house a lot, with them. And it was really fun. It was up at Malibu Beach, and I just adored doing it. And I was so sorry to hear when he passed away.
Yeah. What a remarkable life. A rock and roll name dropper. My life leading up to John Lennon's last interview is the book. Now, if people were looking to track the book down, find out more about you, where best to go?
Well, definitely everyone should check out my book website. And
Yes.
this is going to show it backwards,
There we
but
are.
it's basically confessions of a rock and roll name dropper.com.
Yeah.
And you can go to it, and hopefully you'll print it
For
when
sure.
you post my episode with
Yeah.
you. And it features everything from info about me and my rock radio life and career to tons of super complimentary book reviews that I've had written about me and my book, and plenty of popular podcast, radio, and TV show episodes I've been interviewed on, plus live reads I've done, printed articles, and film documentaries about me and my memoir. And it's all the story of my rock radio related life and career that people want to know about.
Yeah.
And I love talking to them about. And I love being on podcasts, especially yours, Michael. It's been great.
You're very kind, Laurie. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you. And the more I became aware of you and your journey, I started to go down the rabbit hole, and of course, then got through the book. And as I say, it's been a very rich, remarkable life, and you've been very giving and sharing about the experience of living it, not the least of which was that incredible moment for you on December 8, 1980, when, of course, everything changed. And I want to thank you for not only with me today, but in your general way of being in the world. You're very open, you're very sharing, you're very giving. The book's incredibly honest about things that weren't always easy for you. And the more I think people share those elements of their experience, everyone's a little bit better for it. John had that same kind of thing. It was that open, here I am, here's all of it. And I think the book goes a long way to do that as well. It's not just a story about the rock and roll dream coming true. It's also a story about resilience and moving through certain traumas and drama and realizing your dreams. And there's quite an inspiration in that as well.
Absolutely. And what people are really excited about is my book contains a lot of sex and drugs and rock and roll. It really makes them feel cool to read. And that makes me to feel cool to hear. And what I love is when so many people tell me, Laurie, when we normally read books, we read 2 to 3 pages at a time. But your book, we want to sit there and read all 230 pages because we love the way you write and we love the stories you tell. And wow, that makes me feel incredible and talented.
Yeah.
So thank you also for feeling that way.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Best wishes to you for everything that is still ahead on the journey.
Thank you.